in the sprawling darkness of the medieval household, where remedies were often brewed in the same soot-stained cauldron as cheap beer and forgotten scraps. Danger was not an exotic calling card. It was simply there. Before the sophisticated chemistry labs of later centuries, before the dark arts were codified into true treatises of malfeasance, poisoning was profoundly domestic. It was commonplace. The lethal agent did not require a secret vial smuggled across borders. It could be found in a common pantry drawer, tucked alongside spices and salt. If arsenic proved that poisoning could be a matter of pantry mismanagement, then the royal apothecary demonstrated that it was, in fact, an industrial art. The great houses and sprawling court circles held secrets far more potent than common salts and household powders. They were kept within the glass jars and carefully labeled bundles of leaves housed deep inside the apothecary's dimly lit back rooms. These establishments were not merely sites of healing. They were secretive laboratories where the boundaries between cure and poison dissolved into a deadly curiosity. The goal of these skilled practitioners was purification, both physical and spiritual. They believed that illness stemmed from imbalances, a corrupted humors, an excess of melancholy, or perhaps the foul influence of bad diet. And to fix such imbalance, one required equally potent measures. To the modern mind, this entire practice seems wildly misguided. Yet, within the belief systems of the medieval world, this exchange was sacred. A powerful dose, administered by trained hands, would restore the body to its natural state. But where medicine demanded precision, the sheer wildness and potency of nature offered anything but certainty. The apothecary's inventory was an astonishing catalog of toxicological possibility. Consider foxglove or digitoxin in modern terms. Its beautiful heart-shaped flowers were plucked not for decoration, but for their powerful cardiac effects, believed by some folk healers to settle feverish palpitations and calm erratic humors. It required a profound knowledge, a skill few possessed, to walk the razor's edge between the therapeutic dose and the fatal one. A single mismeasurement, an insufficient preparation, and that delicate balance tipped catastrophically. And then there were herbs of greater mystery. Mandrake root, folklore attributed to it a profound magic, suggesting its scream could heal or drive men mad. It was rarely utilized in clean academic settings, but when it appeared in the apothecarial inventory, it carried an almost mythic taint. The apothecary handled these items with a mixture of professional detachment and deep reverence, treating them less as mere botanical matter and more as potent forces of nature that demanded respect. This knowledge, which bridged the gap between herbalism and proto-chemistry, made practitioners invaluable, wealthy, and dangerously powerful figures within society. The real danger lay in this inherent conflict, the intent to heal versus the reality of raw chemical potency. A dose intended for purification might simply be a biological assault. The apothecary's curriculum was less about pharmacology and more about managing lethal possibilities. They taught that every wonderful remedy contained within it an equally potent risk, a potential killer waiting to be unleashed by accident or incompetence. This wasn't the simple malice of adding arsenic. This required detailed taxonomy, deep observation of seasonal flora, precise grinding techniques, and chemical understanding passed down through generations of practitioners. This mastery was not democratic. While common citizens could find rudimentary poisons like ground toad skins or discarded household chemicals, the ability to correctly identify, process, and dose medicinal toxins belonged to an elite few, the court physicians, and their affiliated apothecaries. They were gatekeepers of lethal knowledge. They controlled the narrative around what killed, and more importantly, what preserved life. The practice was also deeply affected by paranoia and status. The pursuit of perfect health became intertwined with the pursuit of divine favor and social standing. Wealthy patrons demanded cures for everything from melancholy brought on by poetry to digestive distress caused by excessive feasting. This relentless demand fueled innovation in lethality, pushing apothecaries to catalog even more powerful and dangerous natural sources. They sourced belladonna bulbs that were too richly colored, foxglove leaves grown in overly humid soil, or fungi whose toxic properties had not yet been documented. The more exotic and powerful the ingredient, the higher its perceived value, regardless of how perilous it was to handle. This deadly curiosity meant that life itself could become a poorly calibrated experiment. A person might ingest what they were told was merely a tonic to clear their humors, only to find themselves suffering from cardiac arrest, triggered by an overdose of overlooked alkaloids. The supposed cure became the ultimate contaminant. It demanded trust, a fragile and often deadly currency exchanged between the desperate patient, the confident healer, and the overwhelming power of botanical toxicity. Thus, the apothecary established himself not just as a pharmacist, but as an agent of profound biological risk, a man who held the knowledge to bring life back, or simply accelerate its end, all within the careful measure of a mortar and pestle. It was here, in this rarefied air of medicinal guesswork, that the seeds for high drama were truly sown. The apothecary taught not just remedy, but risk. And by mastering the exquisite tension between healing intent and deadly dosage, they inadvertently supplied the knowledge base for every poisoner who followed, a profound education disguised as care, where the most lethal curiosity was simply the pursuit of life itself. We move now from the general deadly curiosity of the apothecary to a poison that is arguably more seductive and therefore far more dangerous: We are speaking of Belladonna, or dead nightshade. It possesses an undeniable aesthetic quality. Its deep, velvety black bloom against the twilight hour has haunted art and literature for centuries. This flower, beautiful in repose, holds within it a profoundly intoxicating danger, capable of altering perception, inducing euphoria, and ultimately claiming life with unnerving ease. The deadly nightshade is not a villainous secret kept under lock and key. Rather, its power was derived from its very presence in the natural world. This meant that knowledge regarding it often passed through feminine hands, hedge witches, cosmetic vendors, or even women tasked with preparing household remedies. Its subtle toxicology was less about grand criminal plots and more intertwined with the intimacy of daily life, offering a darkly seductive kind of poison. And herein lies the primary misconception, that its use was solely reserved for murder. While certainly it could be employed in an assassination, a simple dusting on clothing, or added to wine, the initial allure lay elsewhere. Cosmetic enhancement, the perceived beauty of the plant, allowed it into contexts considered safe and personal. Among women of means who desired the perfect complexion or the captivating gaze, Belladonna held its appeal. Its psychoactive alkaloids were sometimes used in tonics meant for purification, but their effects were often indistinguishable from delirium. They might enhance the pupils by dilating them, giving the wearer an exaggerated, almost hypnotic allure, a look that spoke of both unnatural vitality and deep, unsettling mystery. This ritualistic use of poison as a glamorous accessory speaks to a profound period misunderstanding of human biology and botany. The boundary between medicinal application, superficial beautification, and outright lethal misuse was porous, often crossed in the pursuit of an aesthetic ideal. To be beautiful enough was sometimes synonymous with being subtly chemically altered, or at least perceived that way. The narrative surrounding Belladonna is therefore one of intoxicating risk. It demanded a practitioner's skill. You couldn't accidentally poison oneself on a whim. One had to understand the precise preparation, the ratio of petals, leaves, and berries, and when in the process of ingestion or application to skin, this required an almost alchemical precision that belied its natural sourcing. Its potency stemmed from various compounds: atropine, scopolamine, hyoscyamine. These are potent anticholinergics. In modern terms, they disrupt the communication system of the body, leading to classic symptoms that range from visual disturbances, blurred vision, dilated pupils, and seeing halos, to intense gastrointestinal distress and rapid heart rate. The effects were often highly unpredictable, fluctuating between benign delirium and violent poisoning. The danger deepened when we consider self-experimentation. When remedies are designed for purification, or even simply to enhance emotional states, the lines become irrevocably blurred. A woman might consume a tonic believed to clear the humors, a cure for melancholia, perhaps, only to ingest a fatal dose of nightshade berries mixed with common herbal infusions. The intent was healing, the consequence was systemic failure. The inherent risk associated with such beautiful flora fueled both medical breakthroughs and tragic accidents. It positioned Belladonna not just as an exotic poison, but as a commodity tied deeply to female identity and cosmetic desire. It becomes part of a dark pattern, the pursuit of perfection through botanical means, regardless of cost to life. Consider the social context in which this knowledge thrived. These toxic revelations were often confined to specialized groups, the elite apothecaries, or perhaps more perilously, those marginalized women who practiced folk remedies and whose knowledge blended actual herbalism with deep superstition. The recipes themselves were guarded secrets, whispers passed down from mother to daughter, each measure of deadly nightshade a testament to generational risk. The story of Belladonna is fundamentally the story of beautiful deception. It asks us to consider how easily humanity can mistake captivating appearance for inherent safety. A poison can be both deeply decorative and profoundly destructive, its lethality wrapped in velvet petals. The desire to enhance oneself, to draw attention, or simply to escape pain, led directly to a confrontation with nature's most potent chemistry. Ultimately, the understanding of Belladonna reveals something broader about medieval toxicology, that the deadliest poisons were often those derived from what was aesthetically pleasing or intimately familiar. They did not arrive wrapped in sinister vials and delivered by masked assassins. They bloomed in the gardens, decorated the faces, and were consumed in the ritualistic pursuit of a fleeting moment of enhanced existence. If the common powders of arsenic represented accidental or malicious poisoning, then the pursuit of transformation led us to a far more complex and volatile domain. We are now standing within the shadowed workshops of the alchemists, a world obsessed with transmutation. Their goal was not merely death, but apotheoses. They sought to turn base metals into gold, and perhaps even flesh into permanence. In their relentless quest for ultimate glory, however, they became masters of spectacular accident. The pursuit of eternal life and unimaginable wealth meant that deadly knowledge was as commonplace in the crucible as mercury or antimony. To understand alchemical poisoning is to understand a failed ambition, an understanding that chemical curiosity often demanded human consequence. The alchemist operated at the intersection of divine philosophy, mineralogy, and volatile chemistry. They believed that all matter held a perfect spiritual potential, and their craft was simply the means by which humanity could unlock it. This conviction led them to handle materials we now recognize as incredibly potent poisons: mercury, notorious for its devastating effects on the nervous system, antimony, a toxic metal used in various compounds, and mineral acids derived from dangerous, unknown sources. These were not simple backyard powders. Like arsenic, these substances required careful distillation, precise heating, and an intimate knowledge of elemental reaction. The risk was enormous, yet the promise, the gold standard of human achievement, was irresistible. The workshop itself became a site of constant danger. Vats simmered with mysterious liquids, furnaces glowed with malevolent heat, and noxious fumes coiled up from alembics. An alchemical accident was never just spilled liquid. It was often a cascade of unintended reactions, producing blinding vapors or highly concentrated toxins that could affect skin, lung, or digestive tract upon inhalation, touch, or accidental ingestion. The processes they followed were breathtaking in their complexity and equally lethal in practice. Consider the extraction of gold through chemical means. They mixed various acids with base metals in an attempt to precipitate a purified form of wealth. In this pursuit, however, residues and byproducts inevitably formed. These waste chemicals often included dangerous compounds that had no intended purpose but retained immense potency. The knowledge gleaned from these failures became terribly valuable, forming the groundwork for sophisticated poison creation far beyond simple household malice. The alchemists viewed life itself as a chemical equation waiting to be optimized. They subjected themselves, and sometimes others, to grueling purifications and extreme treatments, believing that toxicity was merely proof of efficacy or proximity to ultimate truth. Their ambition created an early toxicological manual through sheer desperation. If gold was the supreme goal, then everything else, even stable life, was treated as a flawed intermediary substance ripe for transformation or disposal. The alchemical poisoning was thus less about malice and more about reckless overreach. It was the consequence of intellectual hubris. They were pushing the boundaries of material science with limited understanding of biological safety. Their bodies, subjected to volatile vapors and corrosive solutions, often bore silent witness to their own deadly innovations. The pursuit of universal perfection meant they mastered the art of creating substances capable of profound systemic failure in others, merely as a byproduct of their great chemical mysteries. Their secrets were fiercely guarded, passed down through apprenticeship under conditions of extreme secrecy. This limited access ensured that alchemical toxic knowledge remained confined to an elite, privileged circle, a deadly commodity far more dangerous than the mere possession of arsenic dust. It required specialized equipment, complex ingredients, and a profound theoretical understanding of nature's hidden rules. To be initiated into this art meant accepting both unparalleled intellectual power and devastating, indiscriminate risk. This secretive knowledge profoundly shaped the culture of suspicion around chemical substances for centuries. When an alchemist failed to produce gold, they might instead produce highly refined poisons, mercury compounds that targeted the brain, potent antimony salts that ravaged the gut. Their perceived failure often became another source of lethal expertise. The desire for glory, whether manifested as literal wealth or philosophical enlightenment, always carried a deadly cost, poisoning both the experimenter and those who eventually utilized their forbidden science. They built not just recipes for gold, but blueprints for despair, forever linking the pinnacle of intellectual curiosity with the lowest form of human sabotage. We have traveled from the subtle domestic malice of arsenic to the controlled danger of the royal apothecary. We've seen how natural beauty, captured in the deadly nightshade, could mask a lethal deception, and how the volatile ambition of alchemists transformed pursuit into deadly byproducts. But if the earlier chapters dealt with deliberate poisoning, the plot, the poisoner's careful hand, this chapter takes us deep into the muck of folk belief, to a place where death was not merely an outcome, but often believed to be a sacred component of the cure itself. This is the realm of the witch and the hedge healer. Here, knowledge wasn't filtered through academic texts or aristocratic curiosity. It bubbled up from desperation, fear, and raw nature. The medicinal treatments prescribed were less about biochemistry and more about spiritual balance, the appeasement of angered spirits, the reversal of ill-will hexes, or simply surviving a fever that seemed to come from above. And often, the bridge between healing intention and outright fatal mistake was nothing more than an untrained mind mixing things indiscriminately. Imagine a crowded cottage kitchen, smoky and dimly lit. The air hangs heavy with boiled roots and burnt herbs. Before us are cures built on potent guesswork, pulverized bone mixed with rendered animal fat, strange fungi gathered only during specific moon cycles, or the venom of creatures that no one had bothered to properly study. These were not recipes for consumption. They were confessions whispered into a boiling cauldron. The folk witch, operating outside the rigid authority of the guild apothecaries, held knowledge gleaned from oral tradition and superstitious desperation. Her remedies often relied on corrupted or misunderstood natural elements, things that shouldn't mix, things whose true effect was unknown, but which offered a desperate promise: salvation. She might use rabbit droppings as a supposed cure for plague fever, combining them with mandrake root and an acidic extract from unidentified berries. The logic behind these mixtures was powerful enough to fool the sick or the desperately believing. In some cases, however, this lack of scientific rigor led to genuinely disastrous results. A tincture meant to clear a spiritual blockage might contain too much raw venom, perhaps concentrated snake bile, intended as an antiseptic, but mixed with highly toxic fungi in the process. The resulting potion would be a volatile blend, pushing the consumer not toward purification, but towards systemic shock. The historical record, stained by paranoia, and the witch hunts that followed, treats these concoctions with a mix of anthropological curiosity and outright condemnation. Were they poisons, or were they misunderstood sacraments? This remains one of history's most tragic ambiguities. The consequence of misidentification, the belief that something mundane was magical, or that a deadly plant simply needed more intention to become curative, was fatal. The brewing process itself became fraught with symbolic meaning. Every ingredient had to be gathered under specific astral alignments. Boiling the components wasn't just for extraction. It was an act of transformation, mimicking spiritual rebirth through chemical degradation. The steam rising from the cauldron often represented both the volatile medicinal spirit and the irreversible ascent toward death. These concoctions show us that in times of overwhelming sickness or societal terror, medical knowledge reverts to its most primal form, ingestion as a gamble. You give it everything: the animal parts, the strange fungal matter, the potent herbal slurry, because you have nothing left to lose except your life. The moment the supposed cure failed, however, the belief system sometimes turned inward, viewing the patient's death not as a failure of the remedy, but as divine punishment for impurity or lingering sin. Thus, the witch's brew represents the collision point, where scientific understanding gives way entirely to myth. Here, survival hinges not on dose calculation, which was impossible, but on blind faith and sheer luck. The deadly potential of nature, initially harnessed by alchemists and later perfected by apothecaries, is here scattered wildly, haphazardly mixed with everything from menstrual blood to graveyard dirt. It is the most chaotic poisoning seminar imaginable, a deadly masterclass in misinterpretation, proving that sometimes the greatest danger lies not in specialized malice, but in simply being profoundly misguided, even when the motive was not malicious, even when it was simply an act of hopeful medicine. The consequences could be profoundly fatal. We have journeyed from common domestic powders to sacred alchemical recipes, and now we arrive at a place best understood by a wry, dark humor: accidental overdose. It is the sheer tragedy of enthusiasm, the disastrous overreach of good intentions. The medieval mind operated with remarkable knowledge about volatile chemistry, yet it lacked the fundamental safety mechanisms that modern science takes for granted. A remedy designed to cleanse the blood or heighten the spirit could contain enough potency to utterly derail a fragile system. The apothecary's shelves were not simply stocked, they were curated wildernesses of potential toxicity. Consider the medicinal frenzy surrounding purification. In an age where illness was often seen as moral failing, divine punishment, or simply imbalance, a cosmic mess that needed violently correcting. The remedies followed suit. If your stomach was upset, it wasn't just food poisoning. It was an energetic block requiring a drastic purge. And what better way to ensure a thorough purge than by stacking potent ingredients upon one another? The desire for maximum curative effect led naturally to synergistic disaster. The unfortunate patient, or indeed the overzealous healer, would meticulously combine various herbs, believing that each single agent contributed its unique virtue. The calming influence of mandrake root mixed with the restorative power of foxglove, perhaps topped off with a touch of wormwood for digestive strength. What they failed to account for was the volatile interaction between these compounds. The alkaloids, the very elements that gave those plants their curative promise, also possessed exponentially lethal properties when combined in excess. The medieval alchemist and the royal apothecary operated under a beautiful, dangerous conceit. That potency was proportional to perceived efficacy. If an ingredient seemed incredibly rare or profoundly symbolic, it must therefore be immensely powerful. And if something was immensely powerful, one might as well use more of it, ensuring that its potent energy flooded the system. This was not merely forgetting a dosage. This was a scientific recklessness fueled by deep desperation. The cumulative toxicity began subtly, often dismissed at first. A sudden stomach ailment attributed to bad river water, or perhaps just the excesses of merriment. But as more cure was ingested over days, the body struggled mightily against a cascade of metabolic overload. Arsenic dust, beautiful and unassuming in Chapter 1, became less about malice and more about poor ingredient mixing. The life-giving virtue of foxglove now carried the potential to induce dangerous heart arrhythmias, striking with an insidious rhythm that mimics natural decline until it simply gives out. The documentation from this era is often maddeningly vague. Records speak of symptoms, vomiting, tremors, cardiac distress, but rarely the specific chemical overload responsible for them. The culprit was usually described in sweeping spiritual terms: bad humors, corrupted blood, or an imbalance of elements. Meanwhile, quietly taking effect within the digestive tract were concentrations of heavy metals and powerful toxins reaching lethal equilibrium. The concept of accidental poisoning is a grim parody of medicine. It suggests that death could be as mundane as making a questionable potpourri, simply by overdoing it on the promise of wellness. These accidental deaths do not carry the drama of political intrigue or the theatrical flair of romantic literature. They are quieter, more brutal in their randomness. They were the quiet footnotes to history, the human cost written into the ledger books of every wealthy household and every ambitious court. Imagine the scene: a worried nobleman, pale with fever. The apothecary, armed with his knowledge, piles remedy upon remedy, a poultice mixed with distilled spirits, an infusion drawn from 3 different woods, a dusting of rare minerals. He is working tirelessly, convinced that this complex synergy will restore life. Yet, for all the brilliance of their pharmacopoeia, they have simply constructed a biochemical time bomb. The ensuing sickness was not merely the illness attacking, it was the remedy itself turning inwards, poisoning the vessel meant to save it. It raises profound questions about the limits of pre-scientific understanding. They were pioneers in toxicology, identifying and utilizing poisons with an accidental genius that bordered on fatal hubris. Their passion for healing often outpaced their caution regarding dosage. In seeking purity, they frequently found only deadly complexity. The result was a tragically potent education, a thorough understanding of what kills, derived not from the intent to harm, but from the sheer overcommitment to life itself. It is a cautionary tale, perhaps, that even in the most selfless acts of aid, the fine line between healing and fatal saturation remains terrifyingly thin. This realization gives the entire toxic landscape of the medieval period its deepest layer of irony. Mastery over death was achieved not through villainy, but sometimes merely through excessive good cheer. Love, in the dramatic tapestry of the medieval mind, death and devotion were often inseparable threads. Poison did not simply mark a crime, it became a tragically romantic prop. To ingest a fatal dose was sometimes mythologized, elevated from simple act of self-destruction to an enduring statement of impossible love. We find this intoxicating melodrama echoed through the poetry, the theatrical scripts, and the private correspondences that survived the centuries. The concept here is deeply ironic. When life itself proved to be too painful, when the commitment required by a passionate heart exceeded the bounds of reality, poison offered a final, dramatic exit, an exit framed not as failure or crime, but as sublime surrender. It was tragedy with an irreversible chemical curtain call. In the courtly literature, the poisoner often became the romantic figure. The slow, beautiful decay, the death that looked too deliberate to be natural. These narratives thrived on heightened emotion, transforming toxicology into a genre of high opera. Consider the idealized fatal romance, the beloved consumed by their own toxins, or those who administered them as an ultimate act of affection. The literature often obscured the brutality behind the beautiful narrative curtain. The physical reality of consuming toxic alkaloids was messy, visceral, and agonizing, but the poetry polished these details until they were indistinguishable from fate itself. Death became a poetic currency, spent not on grand gestures of power or political malice, but on the fragile exchange between two hearts deemed impossibly intertwined. This dramatic lens allowed for profound self-mythologizing. If one's life was destined to be consumed by another, then ending it through a subtly administered toxin became merely confirmation of that predestiny. It shifted the motive from criminal spite, the typical target of poisoning in earlier chapters, to an almost perverse declaration of eternal belonging. The act, therefore, ceased being primarily about elimination and began speaking to themes of transcendence. The poison was not just a method, it was a symbolic binding agent, ensuring that even death could participate fully in the drama of love. It offered a controlled narrative closure where life itself had become unbearable, yet meaningful only through its termination by another. It created what modern scholars might term aesthetic mortality. Death became styled, beautiful, and deeply personal. The method mattered as much as the outcome. Whether it was an ingestion that mimicked a sweet beverage or a subtle taint on a shared meal, the manner lent itself to poetic interpretation, a final kiss of chemical decay. The boundaries between genuine love, madness, despair, and poison became dangerously porous. Was the victim truly distraught over lost affection, or were they succumbing to a carefully dosed toxin that was engineered to mimic natural emotional breakdown? This uncertainty fueled both the art and the fear surrounding fatal romance in medieval sensibilities. The implication for the practice of poisoning itself was fascinating. It demanded not only chemical knowledge, the mastery of compounds derived from belladonna or other potent flora, as seen in previous chapters, but also an exquisite understanding of emotional psychology. The killer had to write a death that would look like destiny, indistinguishable from poetic fate. This focus elevated the art of self-sabotage into a form of performative despair. It was poisoning masquerading as high drama when the stage props were lethal flora, and the dialogue was saturated with doomed passion. The line between artistic expression and chemical reality dissolved entirely. The poison became the ultimate co-star, ensuring that no matter how beautiful the tragedy, it would ultimately prove fatal. The stain of poison in the medieval tapestry was rarely simply a matter of kitchen malice or accidental herb mix-up. When we move beyond the pantry and the curious hands of apothecaries, we arrive at court. Here, where silks draped over velvet and goblets clinked with false conviviality, poison transcended its status as mere murder weapon. It became a tool of ultimate political currency. The stakes elevated dramatically. We are no longer discussing domestic drama or aesthetic suicide, but the cold, ruthless calculus of power played out in the hushed chambers of royal intrigue. The medieval court was a volatile ecosystem built on whispered loyalties and sudden betrayals. Succession crises were common. Marriages were treaties writ small in blood, and every meal consumed could be interpreted as either sacred communion or poisoned offering. In this environment, suspicion became a primary diet, making the poisoner not merely an assassin, but a deeply embedded court insider, often a trusted cupbearer, a lady-in-waiting, or even a seemingly innocuous advisor. The assassination at court was rarely spontaneous. It required careful preparation, impeccable timing, and above all, access. The perfect venoms needed to bypass the defenses of powerful individuals who were accustomed to elaborate physical protection but remained vulnerable in the unguarded ritual of feasting. We begin to understand that the greatest sophistication lay not only in crafting a lethal draught, but in making it indistinguishable from an act of hospitality itself. The poison used in this context needed subtlety, working through the system slowly, mimicking natural illness, until the victim was sufficiently compromised, paralyzed by confusion and feverish delirium. Symptoms had to be vague enough to suggest a divine malady or simple stomach complaint, a sudden wasting sickness that would not immediately raise alarm bells among the assembled nobility, who might view death as glorious or inevitable. The methods described in historical chronicles paint a chilling picture of meticulous engineering. Some accounts detail compounds derived from exotic minerals and obscure flora, substances that left no obvious residue, but rather orchestrated a creeping systemic failure. Imagine arsenic, previously known for its household versatility, elevated to the level of statecraft, used not on a random peasant or rival merchant, but on the very pillar upon which society rested, the monarch. But the true artistry lay in the delivery system. It was seldom slipped into a cup alone. Instead, it might be introduced through elaborate sauces, baked into sweet pastries served at grand banquets, or even mixed into expensive imported wines meant to toast military victories or diplomatic marriages. The feast itself became the instrument of torture and disposal. To consume food prepared by another was an act of trust. Therefore, poisoning the meal was both audacious and profoundly effective. The power dynamic here is absolute. The poisoner controls not only life and death, but also the narrative surrounding the demise. Was it natural causes, a curse, divine will? By controlling the symptoms, they controlled the interpretation, ensuring that suspicion fell upon enemies or random forces of fate, rather than revealing the subtle hand of a rival advisor. The victim often struggled against an invisible opponent. They might suffer extreme bouts of nausea, followed by violent delirium, their body betraying them with seizures and inexplicable wasting. These prolonged agonies were designed to be theatrical yet plausible, ensuring that even after death, the cause remained debated. The true culprit hidden amongst the surviving courtiers, who would then scramble to fill the resulting power vacuum. Consider the political weight behind such acts. A king removed wasn't just a loss of life, it was an upheaval of legal structure, military command, and economic control. The conspiracy involved not just poison expertise, but deep knowledge of court logistics, knowing which wine barrel would be used for the important toast, or which specific serving dish would carry the fatal spice mélange. Furthermore, we see a perverse interplay with the established medical knowledge of the time, because physicians were themselves reliant on herbal remedies and dubious alchemical compounds. Their ability to definitively diagnose poisonings was often compromised. The initial symptoms might be misattributed to poor digestion, consumption from the rigors of travel, or even natural decline, giving the killers precious hours, sometimes days, of operational security. This chapter reveals that political poisoning demanded a combination of alchemical knowledge, the chemistry of decay, botanical expertise, the sourcing and preparation of exotic toxins, and profound psychological understanding of court ritual. It was high drama codified into lethal science. The consequences echoed throughout the fragile structure of medieval governance. The aftermath of one poisoned meal could destabilize entire noble houses, lead to civil war, or shift alliances across national borders. Poison became a symbol not just of betrayal, but of systemic failure, the moment when even the most opulent celebration turns into a stage for ultimate demise. These courtly poisonings are among the darkest chapters in human history, showing that while human desire for power is always present, its ability to be executed often requires the specialized malice, theatrical flair, and deadly chemistry of a master strategist. The supper table, once a symbol of community and feasting abundance, becomes the most treacherous stage imaginable, a gilded cage where every bite promises either glory or oblivion. In the intricate dance of medieval demise, after tales of arsenic in the pantry and the political knives hidden at feasting tables, we arrive at the deepest chasm of all, the deliberate choice to ingest death. This is the final act, the moment when self-sabotage ceases to be a consequence of poor chemistry or hostile intent, and becomes instead an ultimate declaration, a sacrament, a desperate escape, or perhaps merely a means of fulfilling societal exile. To understand this end point, we must move beyond the machinations of other men and into the profound, terrifying silence of the individual will. The medieval concept of death by one's own hand was not uniformly viewed. It existed on a fractured spectrum, ranging from the profoundly pious, the saintly self-immolation, or ritual suicide meant to achieve spiritual purity, to the utterly desperate act committed by those rejected by society. In both cases, the intentional consumption of poison served as an extreme, irreversible piece of dramatic performance. For the adherents of faith, death was often framed not as a tragedy, but as a transcendence. To choose death was sometimes to prove the strength of one's piety or loyalty. The ritual self-poisoning found its deepest roots in religious observance. Think of the ascetic traditions, where physical withdrawal and extreme suffering were seen as purifying the soul, while outright poisoning might have been viewed with suspicion by certain authorities. The concept of administering a final substance, a potent herb or mineral compound, to expedite a spiritual passage was understood within cloistered walls. The very act became an ultimate expression of belief, prioritizing the immortal soul over mere physical existence. The mechanisms were often shrouded in mystery, combining medicinal necessity with spiritual mandate. They might utilize compounds known from the apothecaries, perhaps carefully measured doses of nightshade or mandrake root, but recast them through a theological lens. The substance was no longer merely toxic. It became a necessary bridge to the afterlife. It was less an act of surrender and more a deliberate, ritualized journey. The grand performance ends with the scattering of crumbs and the clinking silence following the final draft. The poisoned cup is set aside, a terrible monument to human fragility. We have tracked these lethal knowledge trails across centuries, from the mundane powder in the pantry to the luminous lethality of nightshade blooming under pale moonlight, from the rigorous chemistry of the alchemist's alembics to the panicked desperation found in the witch's forgotten remedies. But what remains when the assassins are dead and the apothecaries have burned their ledgers? The silence, a profound, sickening silence. This is not merely a conclusion. It is an inventory of a deeply ingrained cultural affliction, the way early modern man processed fear. The fear of invisible sickness, the terrifying capriciousness of the gut bile, the abruptness of death that could strike at any time, regardless of piety or pedigree. This primal dread did not extinguish with the advent of germ theory and clean sanitation. Instead, it simply transformed, calcifying into a deadly legacy. The knowledge of poisons itself became less an applied science for malice and more an academic field, a terrible library stocked with recipes for oblivion. The ability to identify a toxalbumin in foxglove or the metallic sheen of arsenic dust transitioned from being solely a weaponized skill into specialized, highly guarded capital. It was knowledge that could grant status, power, or outright death, depending on who controlled its dissemination. The medieval obsession with lethal substances taught humanity not how to live cleanly, but how to manage profound risk. And this understanding of risk proved far more enduring than any cure for plague or wasting disease. Consider the sheer scope of what we have witnessed. We saw the careful dosage required to simulate a natural systemic failure in a royal figure, a death that could be mistaken for melancholy or feasting sickness. We examined the wild chaos where folk remedies mixed venoms and flora without any chemical grounding, simply through ritualistic necessity. From these extreme endpoints, a terrifying truth emerges. Every effort to manage life inevitably generates methods for its undoing. The poisoning impulse thus became cyclical. It fed off itself. The knowledge gained from studying arsenic's gastrointestinal symptoms informed the suspicion cast upon similar powders later on. The sophisticated botanical understanding gleaned from deadly nightshade-guided practitioners who mistook potent natural compounds for pure medicine. Every act of poison research, whether intended as an assassination tool or a miraculous elixir, deepened the collective and often fatal pool of toxicological wisdom. This is the lethal legacy, that humanity's most sophisticated attempts at self-mastery and societal control were repeatedly undermined by what they simultaneously created, the understanding of systemic failure. The body, viewed through the lens of medieval pseudoscience, was never merely an organic machine. It was a volatile reaction chamber, and knowledge of how to tamper with its core components became an invaluable, terrifying commodity. The myth of the perfect poison lingers because it represents ultimate control. To know exactly what will end a life, whether it is antimony poisoning or the calculated depletion of blood through contaminated wine, is to wield a power that rivals divine mandate. It allowed individuals, from hedge witch to courtier, to feel momentarily omnipotent. The ability to predict, to orchestrate the final breath, was a psychological narcotic far more potent than any drug derived from poppy fields. And so, the cautionary tale remains etched into our cultural DNA. We do not merely fear death, we are fascinated by its mechanics. We study the subtle failure of life systems, the fever that lingers too long, the organ that quietly fails, the toxin that mimics natural decline. This deep-seated curiosity, fueled by centuries of deadly expertise and dramatic necessity, means that even today, the understanding of what kills is a persistent shadow hanging over our medical advancements. The apothecary's counter, the alchemist's formula, the hedge healer's desperate brew, they were all attempts to manage death's inevitability. But in doing so, they meticulously catalogued the pathways to it. They mapped the contours of human collapse with toxic precision. The knowledge that once fueled plots at feasting tables and dramatic exits in poetry is the same knowledge that informs toxicology labs today, transforming a dark historical curiosity into a fundamental component of modern medicine, crime fighting, and forensic science. The silent conclusion, then, is not one of defeat, but of profound continuity. We learn that the pursuit of longevity often necessitates a deeper understanding of cessation. The darkness was never outside the feast hall. It seeped from our own ambitious minds, formulated in secret laboratories, whispered over sputtering fires, and inscribed onto vellum meant for curing illnesses, only to cure nothing at all. What passes as medicine is merely filtered history. What whispers of death is simply highly informed expertise. And that knowledge, that perfect understanding of the body's fragile parameters,